My mother's voice had that careful, rehearsed quality, the kind that comes from a sentence she'd practiced in the bathroom mirror before dialing my number. "Christmas is going to look a little different this year," she said, and I knew before she said another word that different meant without you. "I'm Vanessa Hartley. I'm 32, and I'm a paramedic. I've worked nights on a rig for almost 9 years, the kind of job where you learn what people sound like when they're saying their last words and don't know it yet, where you carry someone's grandmother down 3 flights of stairs because the elevator's broken, where your hands shake on the drive home even though they never shook on the call. I chose this work. I'm certified in critical care transport. I make decisions in 90 seconds that other people get a committee and a week to make. I have never been ashamed of any of it." My younger sister Audrey is 26 and engaged to a man named Whitman Cole, whose family owns 3 car dealerships across 2 counties and a lake house that gets featured in the regional magazine every July. Whitman's parents, Marcia and Dale Cole, host Christmas Eve dinner every year, an event Audrey had described to me more than once as a whole production, with a hired bartender and a string quartet that plays in the foyer while people hang their coats. "They're doing a smaller guest list this year," my mother continued, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, the clink of something being set down too carefully. "Whitman wants to introduce Audrey to his grandfather. Old money, very particular about presentation." "Okay," I said. So, Whitman asked if it could just be close family. "Audrey, us, you know." A pause that stretched long enough I could have driven through it. "He mentioned that with your job, the late shifts, the uniform thing, it might be hard for you to make it work anyway." And another pause. "He said it might be easier on everyone if you sat this one out." I was standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand, and for a second I genuinely could not process the sentence. Not because it was complicated, because it was so simple and so ugly that my brain kept trying to find a kinder version of it. "Mom, are you telling me Audrey's fiancé doesn't want me at Christmas because I'm a paramedic?" He didn't say it like that. How did he say it? She didn't answer that directly, which was its own answer. "He's worried about his grandfather, honey. The man's very old school, very status conscious. Whitman just wants the night to go smoothly. You understand." I did not understand. What I understood was that my sister's fiancé had decided that the woman who pulls people out of car wrecks for a living was a liability at a dinner party, and that my mother had agreed to deliver that message rather than tell him to go to hell. "Does Audrey know you're telling me this?" "She knows it's complicated." That's not what I asked. My mother sighed in the particular way she said when she wanted credit for being uncomfortable without actually doing anything about the source of the discomfort. "I told her I'd talk to you. I'm talking to you. I'm sorry, Vanessa, it's just one dinner." I told her I understood. I did not tell her what I meant by it, which was something closer to, "I understand exactly what this family thinks of me, and I am never going to forget it." I hung up and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, engine off, hands in my lap. Across the street, a kid was out shooting a basketball at a hoop bolted above his garage, missing it more than he made it, laughing every time anyway. I watched him until something in my chest that had clenched up loosened, just enough that I could go inside without crying in front of my own porch light. Here's what nobody in my family knew. 4 months earlier, I'd been accepted into a highly competitive flight paramedic program with the regional medevac service, the kind of position that takes years of applications, and only a handful of people get chosen for each cycle. I'd be flying out on helicopter transports to rural hospitals and accident scenes too remote for ground units, doing trauma care in the air. I'd just finished my final round of clinical evaluations 2 weeks before that phone call, and I was waiting on the official offer letter, which the program director had told me, off the record, was basically a formality at that point. I hadn't told my family yet. I wanted to wait until it was signed and official, and then I'd planned to tell everyone at Christmas, over my grandmother's bourbon pecan pie, the one I make every year because I'm the only one who still has her handwritten recipe card. I'd been so excited to tell them. Now I decided I'd let them have their smaller, more presentable Christmas instead. I didn't call anyone to vent that night. My best friend Priya would have shown up at Whitman's parents' house with a sign, and as much as I loved her for that instinct, it wasn't what I wanted. I didn't call my coworker Marcus either, who'd have said something blunt and true and probably made me laugh, which I also wasn't ready for. I just sat with it. I let the hurt be exactly as big as it was instead of making myself smaller to fit around it, which is something I'd gotten too practiced at doing in this family. Christmas Eve came. I worked a half shift that morning, came home, showered off the smell of antiseptic and cold air, and made myself dinner. Not a sad microwave situation, an actual meal. Roasted chicken, the good kind of mashed potatoes with too much butter, and yes, the pecan pie, because I wasn't going to let Whitman Cole take that from me too. I ate at my own table, in the apartment I pay for with the job that apparently wasn't good enough to be seen in public. It was quieter than I expected. Not sad quiet, just quiet. I lit a candle. I put on music my grandmother used to play. At one point I laughed out loud at nothing in particular, just the absurdity of it all. Sitting there in my socks eating pie while across town, people were rearranging seating charts around my absence. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was what was happening at the Cole house while I was eating my dinner in peace. Whitman's grandfather was a man named Judge Holloway Reeves, retired, 81 years old, the kind of patriarch whose approval apparently mattered more to that family than anyone's actual happiness. He arrived early before most of the other guests, with his daughter, Whitman's aunt, a woman named Patricia Ann Reeves Cole, who ran a private practice as a trauma surgeon 2 states over and rarely made it home for holidays. Over drinks in the foyer, while the string quartet tuned up, Whitman made some offhand comment to his grandfather about how lucky Audrey was to come from such a together family. Doctors, teachers, that whole world. Audrey, standing right there, mentioned she had an older sister too. The judge, polite in the way old men trained in courtrooms are polite, asked what her sister did. Whitman answered before Audrey could. "She's a paramedic," he said, in the tone you'd use to describe someone who'd had a minor scrape with the law. "Ambulance stuff. Couldn't really make tonight work." The judge's daughter, the trauma surgeon, set her glass down. "A paramedic," Patricia repeated. "Which service?" Audrey told her. Patricia's eyebrows went up. "That's the same service that runs the regional flight program. Brutal selection process. I sit on a hospital advisory board that works with their trauma director." She looked at Whitman. "Why isn't she here?" Whitman, visibly recalculating, said something about it being a small gathering, about logistics, about shift work being unpredictable. Patricia asked very evenly why a paramedic's schedule was being treated as an excuse rather than something to plan around, the way you'd plan around any other demanding profession. And that's when my mother, who'd been standing nearby holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched, made the mistake, or the right call, depending who you ask, of telling the truth. She said that Whitman had asked Vanessa not to come because he was worried about how it would look to his grandfather. The room, by all accounts, went very still. The judge, who I'm told had spent most of the conversation looking mildly bored by small talk about caterers and string quartets, turned and looked at Whitman for what Patricia later described to me as a genuinely uncomfortable length of time. "Let me make sure I understand," the judge said. "You disinvited a flight medic from Christmas dinner because you thought she'd embarrass you in front of me." Whitman tried to recover, said something about wanting the night to be smooth, about first impressions. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He told a story instead. One Patricia later repeated to me almost word for word. About being a young attorney decades earlier, about a car accident on an icy 2-lane road outside the county where he grew up, about the paramedics who'd worked on his wife for 40 minutes on the shoulder of that highway in 12-degree weather and gotten her breathing again before the hospital ever saw her. He said he had never in his life met a more impressive group of professionals than the people who do that work, and that any man who was embarrassed to sit at a table with one of them had no business sitting at his table either. It didn't end the party. But Patricia told me later that the temperature of the room never fully recovered, and that Audrey spent the rest of the night looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Not from embarrassment about me, but from embarrassment about him. 5 days later, on a freezing Sunday morning, there was a knock at my apartment door. I opened it to find my mother, my father, and Audrey standing on my front step, none of them dressed for the cold the way they should have been, like they'd left in a hurry and hadn't planned this far ahead. My mother looked like she hadn't slept well in days. My father looked like a man who'd been told to come and hadn't argued. Audrey looked like someone who'd spent 5 days fighting with herself and finally lost. I let them in. I made coffee, because that's how I was raised, even for people who'd recently made it clear what they thought I was worth. My mother started talking first, the words tumbling out fast, like she needed to get them said before she lost her nerve. About Patricia, about the judge, about what had actually been said at that dinner versus what she'd told me on the phone. Audrey kept her eyes on her coffee mug the entire time. "There's something else," my mother said finally, glancing at Audrey. Audrey looked up. Patricia called me. Wednesday. Her voice was small. She wanted to talk about something with the flight program. I didn't even know what she meant, so I asked around, and she stopped, swallowed. Vanessa, are you about to be a flight medic? I told her yes. That I'd gotten the official offer 2 days earlier. That I'd been planning to tell everyone at Christmas, the dinner I wasn't invited to. The silence that followed was one of the most satisfying things I have ever sat inside of, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise or feel guilty about it. My father cleared his throat and said he was proud of me. I thanked him and told him, calmly, that it would have meant more a week earlier, before I spent Christmas Eve alone, because my profession was deemed inconvenient. My mother started crying. I handed her a napkin and let her cry, because some things have to be felt all the way through before they can actually be resolved, and I wasn't going to rush her through it just to make the room more comfortable. I'd had enough of making rooms more comfortable for other people. Audrey apologized. It wasn't a clean apology. There was some explaining herself in there, some I didn't know what to say to him, which told me plenty about what that relationship actually looked like under the surface. But it was real enough, and underneath the explaining, I could hear that she meant it. I accepted it. Not entirely for her sake. Carrying that particular weight around is heavy, and I deal with enough weight on a daily basis that I do for a living. What nobody said out loud, but everyone in that kitchen understood, was this. The exact thing Whitman had been ashamed to have at his table was the exact thing that had made a trauma surgeon and a retired judge respect me before either of them had ever met me. He'd tried to edit me out of the picture, and instead he'd shown his grandfather exactly who he was. Patricia and I had coffee 2 weeks later. She reached out herself, which I thought said something good about her. We talked for almost 3 hours about her residency, about the worst calls either of us had ever run, about the particular loneliness of jobs where you're trusted with people's lives, and then treated like the help at a dinner party. We exchanged real numbers, not the polite kind people give out and never use. Audrey is still with Whitman, last I heard, though my mother tells me things have been tense since Christmas, whatever that means in that family. I don't ask for details anymore. I've stopped auditing other people's relationships for proof that I was right. 3 months later, Patricia called me about an opening on the hospital's trauma advisory board, a seat for a field provider's perspective. Something they'd apparently never had before. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I fly out on my first medevac shift next month. I still smell like antiseptic and cold air at the end of a long one. I am still somehow exactly the kind of person somebody once thought wasn't good enough to sit at a table, and exactly the kind of person other people fight to sit across from.